June 1943. A quiet Texas town prepared for an arrival unlike any in its history. At the train station in Mexia, local families lined the streets, children clutching flags, curious to glimpse the defeated soldiers of Hitler's Afrika Korps. The German officers expected harsh treatment. Maybe cattle cars, maybe barbed wire and barking guards. What they found instead was the first crack in the iron shield of Nazi propaganda. The train that carried them across America was no freight wagon. It was a passenger Pullman coach with cushioned seats that folded into beds, with dining cars serving meals on white tablecloths. One German officer wrote later, "We boarded like tourists, not like prisoners." And when the sun set, another revelation struck them harder than defeat in battle. Every town they passed through glowed with electricity. Street lamps burned bright. Shop windows shone with neon. Houses were lit room by room. In Germany, blackout orders had turned cities into shadows since 1940. On farms, many still lived by candle and oil lamp. But here, in the so-called decadent America, even the smallest towns blazed with light at midnight. For men raised on Goebbels' speeches of American weakness, this was a direct contradiction they could not ignore. The transformation began earlier. In North Africa, when 250,000 Axis troops laid down their arms in Tunisia. Shipped to the port of Oran, the captured Germans encountered something astonishing: efficiency. Thousands of men processed daily. Photographed, registered, given medical checks and inoculations. The Americans explained their rights under the Geneva Convention in fluent German, and then came the food. Bread so soft it seemed unreal. Meat served twice a day. Coffee. Real coffee, not the roasted barley substitute the Wehrmacht had long grown used to. Prisoners at first thought it was a trick, a stage display. Slowly, they learned it wasn't special treatment. It was standard U.S. Army rations. One private wrote home years later, "In the desert, we fought over crumbs. In American hands, even as prisoners, we ate better than our officers had in Africa." The ships that carried them across the Atlantic delivered the next blow to their worldview. They had expected months of waiting, overloaded freighters, misery. Instead, they boarded Liberty ships, cargo vessels produced at a rate no German could believe possible. American guards told them some had been built in under 5 days. To men trained in German industry, this sounded like a fairy tale. On board, food waste shocked them more than the rations. Sailors tossed away bread, meat, and milk without a second thought. Not in mockery, but simply because there was always more. One sergeant noted bitterly in his diary, "They throw away more in a day than we ate in a week." When the convoy reached the American coast, disbelief turned into awe. At Norfolk, Virginia, they saw docks stretching for miles, cranes unloading dozens of ships at once, parking lots filled with workers' automobiles. In Germany, private cars were luxuries. Here, even dock workers owned them. Some owned 2, and then the trains came. Not boxcars, not the 40 and 8s that carried German troops through Europe. No, Pullman coaches with padded seats, air conditioning, and dining service. Guards even apologized for small discomforts, embarrassed that the air conditioning was not fully working. One officer recalled, "Luxury we believed reserved for Hitler's personal train was here, given to his enemies." The journey into the heart of America became a rolling classroom in industrial power. Factories glowed at night, running second and third shifts. Farmers used machines that did the work of entire villages. Grain elevators along the Mississippi held more wheat than whole provinces of Germany. In Kansas, German prisoners saw stockyards overflowing with cattle, while American workers ate beef sandwiches during their breaks. To soldiers who had survived on watery soup and 200 grams of meat per week, this abundance was incomprehensible. One guard bought them hamburgers, meat, cheese, fresh vegetables on soft white bread for 15 cents each. He paid with a single dollar and walked away with change. The prisoners were stunned. This was not propaganda. This was daily American life. When they reached the camps in Texas, the surprises continued. Electric lights in every barracks. Hot showers, flush toilets, medical clinics with equipment German hospitals had not seen in years. And on the shelves, penicillin, a miracle drug whispered about in Germany, but here used even for minor infections, and used freely on prisoners. One German doctor later admitted, "We were losing soldiers at home for lack of basic drugs. In America, they gave us their best medicine without hesitation." To enemies. By the end of 1943, thousands of prisoners had seen with their own eyes what no amount of propaganda could erase. America was not weak, not divided, not decadent. It was richer, stronger, and more united than Nazi Germany had ever imagined. The collapse of belief had begun, not through bullets, but through bread, light, and kindness. By autumn of 1943, German prisoners were no longer just observers from train windows. America had a labor shortage, and soon thousands of POWs were sent into the fields and factories of the heartland. They were trucked daily to cotton gins, sugar beet fields, and canneries. No blindfolds, no secrecy. They saw everything: endless farmland, roads lined with cars, stores overflowing with goods, and factories that never slept. At a cotton gin near Houston, one prisoner watched a single machine process more cotton in an hour than his entire village could handle in a month. The farmer who owned the gin was no aristocrat, no party member, just an ordinary man. Yet his land had electricity, running water, tractors, trucks, even refrigerated storage. His workers, black and white alike, ate packed lunches larger than the rations German workers had received in years. To the prisoners, it was a picture of wealth spread across all classes, not reserved for a chosen few. In Nebraska, men assigned to sugar beet farms saw mechanization on a scale they had never imagined. A single combine harvester replaced 100 workers. The fields stretched beyond the horizon, each one larger than entire German districts. When a farmer's teenage son casually drove a tractor worth more than a Bavarian family earned in a lifetime, the Germans stared in disbelief. To the boy, it was just a tool. To the prisoners, it was another reminder of Germany's limits. The revelations grew sharper in the factories. Though international law forbade prisoners from working directly on weapons, they were assigned to food processing plants, mills, and support industries. Even there, they saw enough to shake the foundation of their beliefs. At a soup cannery, elderly women and teenagers managed entire production lines with the help of machines. Conveyor belts, steam kettles, and automatic filling systems replaced dozens of workers. What stunned the Germans most was how casually these Americans worked, chatting, drinking coffee, even listening to radios, while outproducing German factories running at full strain with forced labor. At steel mills in Ohio, prisoners unloading coal caught sight of furnaces spitting out 10,000 tons a day. For those who had once worked at Krupp or IG Farben, the comparison was humiliating. Germany, despite years of militarization, could not match even one American plant. One POW later admitted, "They wasted more steel in spillage than we could ever produce." And still their workers complained of overtime. By the winter of 1943, another blow arrived. Christmas. Across America, churches and civic groups sent 500,000 packages to the camps, boxes filled with candy, cigarettes, games, and small comforts. Choirs sang carols in German. Boy Scouts delivered hand-drawn holiday cards. Local women baked cookies for men who had fought to destroy their sons and husbands. At Camp Hearn in Texas, prisoners were served a Christmas feast of turkey, ham, potatoes, vegetables, pies, and ice cream. The sheer abundance overwhelmed them. One soldier later confessed, "We ate like kings, better than generals, better than party leaders, and this was not special. They told us this was a normal American Christmas. The kindness was as shocking as the plenty. They had been told Americans were a mongrel race, weak and selfish, ruled by Jews and money. Yet here was a society that not only defeated them in war, but treated them with dignity, even generosity. By 1944, thousands of prisoners were enrolled in classes offered inside the camps. American universities sent books, professors, and even correspondence courses. They studied English, science, history, and economics. For men who had been taught that truth came only from Berlin, the free exchange of ideas was a revelation. One German physicist captured in North Africa listened to American professors some of them Jewish refugees from Europe, teach physics and chemistry without bitterness, without hatred. He later admitted, they were years ahead of us, and yet they shared knowledge with us, their enemies. This spirit of generosity was more devastating to Nazism than any bomb. Prisoners also watched American films. Gone with the Wind, The Grapes of Wrath, movies that showed not glory but struggle, mistakes, and criticism of America itself. In Germany, to admit failure was treason. Here it was art, and it made the nation stronger. The more they saw, the clearer it became. Everything they had believed about America was false. By the time 1944 arrived, many no longer dreamed of German victory. They still longed for their families, still felt loyalty to their homeland, but they no longer spoke of Hitler's triumph. Some began to wonder if democracy, not dictatorship, was the future. What guns and tanks had failed to break, bread, light, and freedom were slowly destroying. By mid-1944, German prisoners had lived in America long enough to see the full scale of its war machine. What they witnessed went beyond abundance. It was industrial power harnessed by an entire society when they were sent to assist in lumber camps, mills, and food plants. They saw women working side by side with men, operating heavy machinery, welding, driving trucks. In Nazi Germany, propaganda had glorified women as mothers and homemakers. Here, women built ships, planes, and tanks, and the economy didn't collapse. It grew stronger. In Louisiana, prisoners assigned near Higgins Industries glimpsed assembly lines where workers produced the landing craft that would soon carry Allied troops onto Normandy's beaches. The speed stunned them. Teams of women and African-American laborers cut, welded, and riveted around the clock. Entire boats rolled off the line daily. Prisoners who once believed in Aryan superiority were forced to confront the reality that people their leaders called inferior were outproducing the Reich. The lesson repeated itself in Detroit. From afar, some saw the River Rouge plant, where Ford turned out bombers by the hour. A single American factory could equal the yearly aircraft production of Germany. What shocked them most was not just the scale, but the openness. American guards never tried to hide this power. They wanted the prisoners to see. In fields across the Midwest, Germans worked shoulder to shoulder with Mexican migrant laborers and black farmhands. They watched men and women of different races eat together, sing together, even joke with the guards. It was not equality, but it was a world apart from the rigid hierarchies of Nazi society. One prisoner wrote later, "We were told these people were slaves. Instead, they were free and better fed than we were in uniform." Letters home revealed the slow crumbling of belief. While German censors cut many lines, hints slipped through. Mentions of plentiful food, of kind treatment, of a country without bombing raids. Families in bombed-out Hamburg or Cologne could hardly believe such stories. Yet the words kept coming from thousands of men, each saying the same thing. America was nothing like the propaganda had claimed. By the end of 1944, the shift in mindset was clear inside the camps. Fewer prisoners painted swastikas on walls. Some tore Hitler's portrait from their bunks. Others joined discussion circles organized by German exiles who had fled the Reich and now returned as U.S. instructors. They debated democracy, freedom, and what a post-war Germany might look like. Even simple leisure chipped away at old loyalties. Baseball games, libraries filled with books, orchestras that performed Bach and Beethoven, all provided by the captors. It was not weakness, but confidence, a demonstration that America could win a war and still treat its enemies with humanity. The collapse of faith was not total. A minority of diehards remained, still saluting secretly, still clinging to Hitler's promises of miracle weapons. But for the majority, the spell was broken. They had seen the factories, the farms, the cities lit with endless electricity. They had eaten hamburgers larger than a ration loaf, smoked cigarettes that seemed infinite, and received medicine that Germany could not provide even for its children. They no longer asked, "Will Germany win?" The question became, what kind of world will we return to when Germany loses? In quiet conversations under Texas skies, many prisoners admitted what they could never have said back home. The war was already lost. not only on the battlefields of Normandy or Russia, but in the warehouses, the shipyards, the kitchens, and the hearts of ordinary Americans. Defeat, they realized, was not shameful. The true shame was how completely their leaders had lied to them. And so, in camps thousands of miles from home, under guard yet strangely free, the undoing of Nazism began, not by force alone, but by the everyday strength of a democracy that proved itself without boasting. By early 1945, the war in Europe was collapsing, and German prisoners in America knew it before many of their families back home did. Newspapers delivered daily to the camps spoke of Allied advances from the West and the Red Army pushing from the East. Rumors of Hitler's secret weapons still circulated, but few believed them anymore. They had seen too much of America's strength to expect miracles. The atmosphere inside the camps shifted. Men who once spoke proudly of the Reich now avoided the subject. When Germany's cities burned under Allied bombing, prisoners read the casualty lists with quiet despair. Many wept, not for the army, but for their families, their wives and children trapped under falling rubble. At Camp Swift in Texas, one group of prisoners listened as an American guard read news of the Ardennes offensive. For a moment, hope flickered. Hitler had struck back. But when the prisoners realized the offensive had failed, the last illusion of victory shattered. One man muttered, "Now it is only a question of how long we can survive." The guards noticed the change, too. Fewer escape attempts were made. Discipline problems decreased. The Germans no longer behaved like soldiers awaiting orders. They acted like men preparing for an unwanted return to a ruined homeland. Then, in April, the rumors became undeniable. Hitler was dead. The Reich was finished. Inside the barbed wire compounds of Texas and Oklahoma, silence fell as radios confirmed the news. Some diehards cursed and swore revenge. Others simply stared at the ground, hollow-eyed. Most felt a strange mixture of grief and relief. The end had come at last. The Americans did not gloat. In many camps, guards allowed prisoners a moment of mourning. Chaplains held services for the dead. For men who had expected cruelty, this dignity was confusing, almost painful. By May, Germany surrendered unconditionally. In the camps, the reaction was muted. No cheering, no collapse. Just resignation. One prisoner wrote, "The world we were promised is gone. Now we must see what kind of men we are without it." Yet even in defeat, the lessons of America continued. When the war ended in Europe, the prisoners expected punishment. Instead, they were given concerts, lectures, even vocational training. American officers told them plainly, "You will rebuild your country. You will need these skills." Some were sent north to harvest timber, others to farms still desperate for labor. They were treated not as enemies, but as workers, and sometimes as guests. Farmers invited them into kitchens for meals. Children asked them to play soccer in the fields. The humanity was disarming. But the hardest part was waiting. Repatriation did not come immediately. With shipping scarce, prisoners remained in America through 1945, even into 1946. Many dreaded going back. For all the longing to see family, they feared what awaited them in the ruins of Hamburg, Berlin, or Dresden. In America, they had food, safety, and dignity. In Germany, there would be rubble, hunger, and shame. During those long months, conversations inside the barracks turned serious. Some men admitted their guilt for believing Hitler's lies. Others argued bitterly, clinging to fragments of ideology. But most agreed on one truth: Germany could never rise again through tyranny. They had seen another model, one that worked not by fear but by freedom. At night, when the camp lights glowed against the Texas sky, prisoners whispered to each other, "This is what our country must learn. Not bombs, not hate, but electricity, bread, and freedom for all." By the end of 1945, thousands of Germans were preparing to return, not just as defeated soldiers, but as witnesses to a different kind of world. In 1946, after months of waiting, the orders finally came. German prisoners began the long journey home. For many, stepping onto the ships bound for Europe brought mixed emotions. They longed for their families, yet feared what they would find. The America they had lived in, safe, abundant, and alive, was not the Germany they would return to. When they arrived, their fears were confirmed. Cities were flattened, rail lines shattered, factories gutted. Families lived in cellars or in the ruins of bombed apartments. Food was scarce, electricity unreliable, and black markets ruled daily life. To men who had eaten hamburgers and seen endless trains of wheat in Kansas, the contrast was devastating. They tried to explain to their families what they had seen in America. Lights in every town, refrigerators humming in kitchens, cars in the driveways of ordinary workers, women building ships, farmers driving tractors across endless fields. Many relatives thought it was exaggeration or worse, propaganda from the enemy. But the returning prisoners insisted. They had lived it. It was real. Over time, their stories spread. Former POWs became quiet teachers of a different future. They told neighbors about democracy not as weakness, but as strength. They described how America allowed free speech, how even its films criticized its own society without fear. They spoke of medicine, education, and opportunity shared not just with elites, but with ordinary people. In ruined Germany, these ideas found fertile ground. People were tired of lies, tired of hunger, tired of tyranny. The testimony of thousands of returned prisoners helped break the last remnants of faith in Nazism. Some men went further. They joined local councils in occupied zones, helped rebuild schools, and supported the new democratic institutions taking root under Allied supervision. Others simply carried the memory into their homes, raising children to see America not as an enemy, but as an example. Historians would later call this the silent reform. It did not come from lectures by Allied officers or speeches by generals. It came from ordinary German soldiers who had once sworn loyalty to Hitler, but who, behind American fences, discovered a different way of life. The irony was deep. The very men captured as enemies became carriers of democracy. What bombs had not destroyed, hamburgers, movies, and electric lights had quietly undone. By the early years of the Cold War, when West Germany rose from ruins into prosperity, many of the men who had once been POWs in Texas or Nebraska remembered what they had seen. They worked to build an economy that valued abundance, a society that valued freedom, and a nation that, for the first time in generations, was not driven by war. The story of these prisoners is not one of humiliation, but of transformation. They left Germany believing in Hitler's 1,000-year Reich. They returned believing in something far more powerful, the strength of ordinary people, free and unafraid, and in that, their captivity became not just a footnote of war, but one of its most unexpected victories.